Hey, what's happening today, Push Kids? We're here for our next lecture in AP US History. Today we're going to be covering topic 4.8, Jackson and Federal Power. Our learning objective today is 4H, explain the causes and effects of continuing policy debates about the role of the federal government between 1800 and 1848. We've got two main key ideas today. Our first one is a little bit long, but kind of ties into some of the things that we've been talking about up to this point. And it says by the 1820s and 1830s, new political parties arose. The Democrats, led by Andrew Jackson, and the Whigs, led by Henry Clay, that disagreed about the role and powers of the federal government and issues such as the national bank, tariffs, and federally funded internal improvements. So to really kind of understand this era, which is oftentimes referred to as the Age of Jackson, we really want to understand first how Jackson came to power. And to understand that, we have to talk about the election of 1824. Now, the election map that you see here is one that you've seen similar ones of up to this point. But there's a few things that I really want to point out about this particular map that we haven't really seen up to this point so far. First of all, we had several people running for the presidency. We've got four running. John Quincy Adams, that's the son of John Adams, the second president of the United States. Andrew Jackson, the hero of the Battle of New Orleans during the War of 1812. Crawford, and then Henry Clay, who is the person who comes up with the Compromise of 1820. He is the person that is the kind of ideas man behind the American system, and he'll do a lot of other things kind of later on. But what you see here is that they're really splitting their vote and is very regional in many ways. Jackson wins much of the South and the Southwest United States. Clay wins good bits of the Midwest, Ohio, Kentucky, Missouri. John Quincy Adams wins most of the Northeast. Crawford wins a few of the states in the middle, Georgia, Virginia, which is, a pretty big state at that time. But the problem is that no one wins a majority of the electoral vote. Now, Jackson, if you notice, he wins the popular vote. Now, popular vote means the total number of people that voted for him. So Jackson receives 153,544 total votes. And do also remember that we're getting into the time period where we're starting to see suffrage expand. That universal white male suffrage we talked about in lecture 4.7 is starting to come into play. Quincy Adams receives the next most amount of votes, but significantly fewer. He only receives about 2/3 of the vote total of Jackson. And Jackson also receives more electoral votes than any other candidate, but not over 50%. You need to win at least 51% of the Electoral College to become the President of the United States. So what ends up happening is, even though that Jackson does well in the South and the West, and Clay is limited to those few Western states, Crawford wins Virginia, but not really anywhere else, all things we've talked about. But because no one wins 51% of that vote, the House of Representatives gets to determine that presidential winner. And they went round after round of voting without anybody winning. Adams is going to end up winning, and here's how that works out. Because Henry Clay is going to throw his support behind him. Now, the reason why he does this is, we'll kind of explain on the next slide, but Jackson is pretty upset about this. He clearly had gotten more votes than John Quincy Adams, had clearly been more popular nationally, but doesn't win. And they call this the corrupt bargain, that Adams had bought the presidency from the American people, and Henry Clay had kind of gone in on it. Now, was it a corrupt bargain? Well, let's check the chart out and see if that's really it. Now, let's look at who becomes president versus Secretary of State. So notice George Washington, our first president, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams is the VP. And so it kind of follows this line, right? The VP becomes the president, and the VP for Adams was Jefferson. Jefferson becomes the president. But then notice how the pattern shifts. James Madison is the Secretary of State for Thomas Jefferson, and then he becomes the President of the United States. Then James Monroe is Madison's Secretary of State. He becomes President. Then JQA, and then JQA. So what's Henry Clay thinking? Well, I'm going to throw my support behind John Quincy Adams. I'm going to become the Secretary of State, and then that is going to then propel me into the presidency the next time that it's open for me. Now, that's going to happen fairly quickly, because John Quincy Adams is, like most Adams, a great non-president. He had had a fabulous political career up to this point, but he's a pretty terrible president. And there's really this next election in 1828 is just absolutely awful. It really shows the effectiveness of political parties in elections. We see tons of mudslinging, lots of propaganda. For instance, Andrew Jackson's camp says that Adams is a puppet of the czar. And claims that he's even installed a pool table in the White House. Apparently, that's a bad thing. On the other hand, Adams talks about how Jackson's wife was a bigamist and had previously married another man and was now married to two different men, which was actually technically correct. But it's just really nasty on both sides. Politics in our country have never been clean affairs. Like if you think elections today are bad, they were also bad back then. It doesn't really make any of it right, but it's just the way it is. And we also saw with the election of 1828 these exciting appeals to average people, public rallies, barbecues, and they gave out plenty of alcohol. So once again, Ms. Jackson was a bigamist. They called Mrs. Adams a bastard. Some pretty terrible stuff. And they also tried to present people as in different lights. Like Jackson is old hickory, like he's so tough. Even though he's uneducated, he's a hero and a dueler, a man of the people. Democrats paint Adams as being an out-of-touch aristocrat. What's kind of interesting is our current president, Donald Trump, has Jackson's picture in the Oval Office in many ways because he's trying to also present this persona as a man of the people. So Jackson wins the presidency in 1828. He is the first what we call common man president. He was born poor, he was uneducated, and he was from the West. Now, the West at this point means that he's on the other side of the Appalachians. Remember, we're not really going much past the Mississippi River at this point, although we own that territory, not much past there. Now, who is he? He's born in a log cabin. He's a hero of the war. He was someone that, was perceived as being a very kind of tough individual. And so 1828, because of all this, he wins handily against John Adams. Now, it's not like John Adams had a great presidency. All Adams have terrible presidencies, and John Quincy Adams is no exception to this rule. And Jackson, in a one-on-one battle, trounces John Quincy Adams. And the people are incredibly happy. They show up to celebrate in huge numbers and trash the White House, ignoring any security or the need for tickets. They consume a 400-pound wheel of cheese, and I believe it's 40 kegs of beer and wine during the entire thing. Pretty rowdy affair. It cost a lot of money to fix up the White House afterwards. Now, Jackson's victory is going to split the Democratic-Republican Party, though. And what this does is this has some pretty big impacts politically, because this leads directly to the formation of the Democratic Party with the election of Andrew Jackson. Now, that's the same Democratic Party that we have today. So the Democratic Party of today traces its lineage all the way back to Andrew Jackson with the election of 1828. Now, Jackson and his supporters are going to hope to return to the Jeffersonian ideals of states' rights, protection of liberty, Western expansion, and this really becomes known as the Age of Jackson. Now, it lasts from 1824 to 1840, and it's going to change American politics. It's a new political system called Jacksonian Democracy. Now, Jacksonian Democracy is going to emphasize the power of common men over the powerful elite. And he does this in several different ways. The first way is he actually gets rid of many of the powerful elite that are in Washington. It's really Jackson who's the first one to really talk about draining the swamp in Washington, to use a common political or modern political phrase. So what he does is he encourages the use of what's called the spoils system. And so what he does is he gets rid of these government bureaucrats that many people had believed to be ineffectual or corrupt. I mean, the ideas that we have today are not new ideas in American politics, guys. And what he does is he replaces many of these people with his own loyal party supporters. Now, this system known as patronage, was seen as very, very democratic because it gave government jobs to new people. The problem with this entire system, though, was that it was often inefficient and led to even more corruption on top of this. Many of the government bureaucrats have been there for years, were very good at their job. They were professional government employees, and he's bringing in really random people from his political campaign, and they're not very, very good at their jobs. Now, Jackson does have a two-term presidency, and there's three major conflicts we want to quickly talk about. So the first one is the idea of sectionalism. The issue of tariffs was the biggest issue dealing with sectionalism during this particular time. Tariffs had always been one of the major issues that had divided different regions of the country as well as different political parties. Now, generally speaking, northern states favored tariffs because they profited when American people bought more American-made goods, and it's in the north that these American-made manufactured goods are being produced. However, many southern states are going to oppose tariffs because these goods, oftentimes made in other countries, become therefore more expensive, and it also leads to retaliatory tariffs on American cotton as well. Now, Congress in 1832 is going to pass a new high tariff. Now, southern states are going to claim that their states' rights are being violated. And the vice president at that time, a guy named John C. Calhoun, is going to threaten that South Carolina would nullify or ignore the unfair federal tax. Now, this issue of nullification has come up before, specifically in our last unit when we talked about the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which attempted to nullify the Alien and Sedition Acts. Now, this specifically led to what was called the nullification crisis. Now, John C. Calhoun, once again, the Vice President of the United States, supports nullification as a way for states to protect themselves from the national government. Now, he thought it was an issue of last resort, and states could potentially secede, that means leave the Union. Now, on the other hand, Jackson does not support the tariff either. He sees much more of a states' rights kind of guy, but he sees this nullification crisis as a threat to not only the unity of the U.S., but also his political power as President of the United States. He urges Congress to pass something called the Force Bill to enforce the tariff. Now, the nullification crisis comes to an end when once again Henry Clay comes in and is able to kind of stitch the sides together, introducing a new lower tariff called the Compromise of 1833, or the Compromise Tariff. Now, but overall, though, this conflict is going to reveal sectional tensions between North and South, and once again we get this idea of states' rights to argue secession from the Union was possible. Now, Jackson had been willing to use force to protect the power of the national government over the states. Now, we're going to talk about the second and third conflicts coming up in our next video here in just a second.